we appreciate that you've built up a lot of wisdom in this whole world of catechetics, religious education, how not to do it, how to do it, what might be good practice moving forward, where we're moving into in terms of the future. So we're very much interested in what you have to say.
Fine. So first of all, I present myself now. I'm Father Renè. I'm a Catholic priest. I was a lecturer in dogmatic theology, or at our university here in Malta for 36 years. Then I retired, and soon after my retirement, there was a need here in hospital. The bishop was searching for chaplains, because we've had for so long a tradition of friars, Capuchin friars, taking care, managing the chaplaincy at the hospital. But now they are out. And so it has become all diocesan, and now I'm here, after my retirement. And during my lectureship, I spent practically 12 years responsible for catechesis in my diocese here in Malta. Of course, I never studied catechetics, but I was responsible for catechesis, and especially both catechesis and the teaching of religion in schools, where here in Malta, even it's still written in our constitution, that the government provides the teaching of the Catholic religion in schools. Now, how long that will continue to be like that, we are not sure, but it is still there anyway, even if things are changing and changing fast, as I presume they are changing fast also there in Ireland. So, well, in this brief presentation, which roughly this is the wavelength, the line of thought which I followed in my presentation back in April. But, I confess that back in April, I did not have a formal presentation prepared. So I wanted to go back there, but at the same time, prepare myself also for this presentation this morning. Well, on different levels, when we speak about the church, about Christian living, about catechetics, about theology itself, I think that we all, it's commonplace today to speak in terms of challenging times. And of course, challenging times, mainly when we speak specifically about catechetics and about evangelization, I think that what is becoming mostly challenging, especially from my experience here in Malta, is, connecting with people who are not bad people, who thirst for what is good and also probably for God, but who are alienated from the church, who do not come to church. Today we have entire generations who no longer practice, who no longer come to church, but who are still in search of God. And I think that it is a major challenge for all of us to continue to connect with these people. And so to continue to be rather on the same, I would say, wavelength, especially where they are searching and what they are searching for. Because basically, even if we take our perspective, as practicing, well, I presume we are practicing, at least speaking for myself. But I think that even from our perspective, personal perspective, at the end of the day, we are all seekers. Even if I am a believer, I'm still a seeker, basically. And I'm still a seeker because it's, today I think a point which intrigues me so much is precisely this, that the opposite of faith is not unbelief or atheism. I think that the opposite of faith is thinking that we can discover nothing new in our faith and in our beliefs. And so we are all seekers, we are all exploring deeply what we believe, what we have received. Of course, when I speak about this challenge of connecting with people, I think that one of the things we need to keep in mind is precisely that many believers today are not rooted or have not been formed in a tradition which was inspired by the Christian faith. Well, at least I speak for myself and my generation. We were brought up in a culture which was formed and inspired by the Christian faith. Today, there are so many believers. I'm still even today responsible for catechesis in my parish where I work. And this is something which, I see daily, so many people in the preparation for parents, for example, who have children for First Holy Communion, for confirmation, I see so many people of the emerging generations who, whether they are believers or not, but what is sure is that they are not rooted in a tradition which is inspired by the Christian faith. The tradition of values which they have received, in which they were brought up, especially in these last, 30, 40 or 20 years, is a tradition which, is radically different from the one we were brought up in. Normally we say, well, this is the old Christendom which is gone. We no longer live in an era of Christendom. And so I think that the future of faith today is calling for greater creativity and imagination. Because something which we need to come to terms with, I believe firmly, is that, well, the secular has not only impacted on society and culture, but the secular has and is impacting also on the way we believe, on our faith, even on our content of faith, So I think that in our exploration, in our search, we need to come to terms precisely with this reality of our faith. And, well, as we all know, I'm saying nothing new, but as you all can imagine, the tragedy of any generation is precisely when that generation fails to pass on what it stands for. I think this has been always, since its beginning, for the church, this has been always a major challenge, the transmission of the faith. And nowadays, there has been this shift, these radical changes, especially in the last century and nowadays. And so coming to terms with this situation is precisely this, what are we going to pass on to the emerging generations? What do we have to hand on to these generations? Because I repeat, it would be a tragedy, if we as a generation, where values, beliefs, faith are concerned, if as a generation we no longer have this, content, if you want, or perspective to pass on, to hand on, well, that would be tragic for us all. But when we come to this transmission of the faith, I think it is very important for us to understand something which for me is, basic. The lesson which so often we seem to forget, that this transmission of faith is no longer, probably it has never been, but it is surely no longer the monopoly of those who hold the office of teaching in the church. I think that nowadays it is collectively, it is the community of believers that transmits the faith. There are so many parents, so many teachers in class, who are living witness to what they are handing on to the emerging generations. There is no need for one to be a priest, a bishop, a pope, It's no longer the monopoly of those who hold office in the church. Why? Because when we speak about the transmission of the faith, basically, what are we speaking about? We are speaking about a living tradition. And this, of course, reminds me, it makes me go back to something which is so basic and important in the Second Vatican Council. Particularly, if we go to the Constitution on Divine Revelation, Dei Verbum, chapter 2, which speaks about precisely the transmission of this living tradition. It is a living tradition. We are not here speaking about transmitting, doctrines, rules, commandments. We are not transmitting a content which can become stagnant for many people. But we are speaking about a living tradition. Something, this was something which for so many years I was lecturer in, and so it's very dear to me, this point. Why? Because when I refer to this constitution, to this document, which for me is one of the most important, if not the most important, documents of Vatican Council II, Dei Verbum, I repeat, the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation. Well, this was a document which practically evolved throughout the entire span of the council, almost 3.5 years. It was one of the first documents which was presented to the Council Fathers in October 62, and it was one of the last documents in December 65, which was promulgated. Which means what? Well, it means that this living tradition, it took the entire span of the council for the Council Fathers to see how, what we understand by this living tradition was evolving hand in hand with the vision of the church, which was unfolding throughout those 3.5 years of council and of council debates, discussions, reflections, because these are intimately connected. We cannot speak about a living tradition if we do not understand the church in terms of people of God, community of believers. Nowadays, with Pope Francis, something which we have recovered, it's not discovered, but we have recovered it because it has been a basic truth, but of course, like so many other truths, unfortunately forgotten. The sensus fidei, the sense of the faith of the people, the sensus fidelium of the entire community. And so these are intimately linked. If you want, technically, well, what the document on the church, Lumen Gentium, what it says in chapter 2, and what Dei Verbum on Revelation says in chapter 2, they are intimately connected. I would highlight those two chapters as amongst the most important which Vatican Council II has given us. Because, I repeat, we are speaking about a living tradition. I love quoting, a theologian who had also become a cardinal, Avery Dulles, who in one of his books, I quote, he writes, Catholicism has an incomparable intellectual, cultural, mystical, and spiritual heritage. And he asks, why does it appear so stagnant for so many people, for entire generations nowadays? Why is this living tradition, living heritage, why has it become so stagnant? Even I would say so meaningless for so many people. Well, it's always the question about the message and the messenger. We may be, great believers about the message, but what about the messengers? Who are those who are transmitting, handing on this living tradition? Catechists, teachers of religion, parents, priests, in our preaching. What are we handing on? What are we handing on? How are we dealing and handling this living message, this living tradition, to making it more meaningful, to making it also more relevant nowadays and to our times? Well, up to now, by and large, it was commonplace for us all to speak of secularization and to understand secularization as a major obstacle in this process of transmission of the living faith and of the living tradition, which we hold. But of course, as Pope Francis likes repeating, we are no longer in an era of changes. We are in a changed era. Today, we are already speaking, well, we have been for quite some time now, about the fourth industrial revolution. And we know that if there is a fourth industrial revolution, well, there have been a preceding 3 industrial revolutions, which, as we know, they were industrial revolutions which have revolutionized, which have changed the way we live, our styles of life, making our lives more comfortable, more easy, if you want. But this fourth industrial revolution is radically different from the other 3. Because nowadays, the fourth industrial revolution is changing not only the way we live, but it is changing who we are. It is changing our identity. Technology nowadays, I'm not against technology, of course, but technology nowadays is changing who we are. It is impacting not only on our styles of living, but it is impacting on what is human. And of course, I'm making this point. Why? Because catechesis cannot ignore all this. Catechesis needs to take up the major challenges that nowadays are coming from the situations which we all live. And so one of the major challenges for catechesis, at least for me, is the challenge to excogitate, to think out new pedagogies of faith, new ways of teaching the way to goodness, which, of course, teaching the way to goodness, we all acknowledge it goes much deeper than just imparting doctrine, rules, and commandments. I think that today we need to recover an old vision about life, about what makes life meaningful, which we have forgotten, because unfortunately in these last centuries, I'm not going to enter into details about what brought us here. But as you all know, for centuries, we have practically identified faith with doctrine. And so we have identified Christian living with simply the commandments, forgetting all about the Beatitudes, forgetting all about the basic message of the entire gospel, which of course is not exhaustive with the 10 commandments. And so we need to go much deeper in our vision. There was an old vision, even in the Middle Ages, two main authors, like, for example, Thomas Aquinas and Dante himself with his Divine Comedy. I think that they were two who, in their vision, what they envisaged was that what is the purpose of living? Well, the purpose of life is a journey, and it is a journey in search of God and in search of happiness. Now, we may, of course, agree or not agree with that, but I think that in our perspective today, in our vision, the vision which we need to impart today, especially when we are teaching the way to goodness, is precisely this, that at the end of the day, this vision about searching for God and searching for happiness, almost putting God and happiness on one and the same level, I think it's very important for us, especially today when we are facing, major challenges coming, of course, from radically changed situations and culture. I want to go back in time, because I think that Augustine himself, living at a point in time almost, I would say, similar to ours, when with the fall of Rome, Augustine was living in a time when the dominating and supporting culture of the Roman Empire came down. When Christianity, had to fend for itself. And Augustine there spoke about this new pedagogy of the faith in basic texts, particularly not only in his confessions, but even in his, De Catechetics Rudibus, for example, a basic text. Well, why? Because this is the novelty and so the innovation which Augustine was providing. Augustine was practically arguing in this manner, and up to the 6th century of Christianity, after, experiencing even at times of persecution, but then Christianity was experiencing times of, living comfortably within the context of the Roman Empire, which was a culture, dominating from one aspect, but at the same time supporting the Christian faith. And so supporting the transmission of the faith and the expansion of Christianity itself. Now, when the Roman Empire came down, Augustine, for him it was not so tragic, but Augustine was discovering at that time precisely this. Now Christianity no longer has the support of culture. And so it needs to propose itself, And I think that what makes his time and ours very similar is precisely this. For centuries in the West, I speak about Malta, I think it's the same thing with you in your country. But for centuries, our culture and our religion were one and the same thing. They were identifiable, Our religion was our culture, and our culture was our religion. Up to some time ago, if you were Maltese, undoubtedly you are Roman Catholic. Well, that is no longer the case, of course. And so if for centuries we lived in a context where faith and culture were identifiable, nowadays it's no longer the case. Nowadays we are living in a culture which, we need not envisage negatively. It is a culture, but which, may not be inspired as in past times by the Christian faith, by the gospel. It is inspired by other values, very different also. But, it is at this point in time that we are called to rediscover anew what the Christian faith possesses, the heritage which we have received, and which needs to be discerned from, the cultural elements which are no longer there supporting. And so this is, of course, for me, a very important challenge, because even, for example, Augustine in his Confessions, and also in other texts, he speaks so much. For me, this is mostly important, especially in the context of catechetics. Augustine speaks so much about transformative experiences. Transformative experiences, which is very different from just, envisaging catechetics in terms of transmitting doctrine. But it is in terms of transformative experiences. As you know, the underlying, truth in Augustine's Confessions, what is it? It is that the transmission of the faith needs to be autobiographical. If it is not autobiographical, it risks being merely a content, a doctrinal content, which so easily can become stagnant. Not only for adults, but even for the children, for the emerging generations. So, as you know, the buzzword since the Second Vatican Council for us all was reading the signs of the times. Of course, we consider it still important. We need to have a reading of the present. We need also to name the present, to understand the culture we are living in, to understand the situation we are surrounded with. But we cannot remain stuck in the reading of the times we live in. Because, since Vatican Council II, that's why I call it a buzzword. Well, we have been reading and reading and reading, and producing entire, studies about what is happening, about reading the signs of the times, but now we need to move on. The reading of the reading of the present, the reading of the signs of the times should lead us to two other very important stages. It should lead us to discernment. We need to discern, not only reading the culture which we live in, but then we need to discern. We need to have the wisdom to understand, what is the culture and what is the faith which we need to transmit. And then the third stage, which is prioritize. We need, after discernment, we need prioritization. We need to prioritize. In our evangelization, in our catechetics, we need to prioritize in the sense of, going back to basics, going back to the essentials. And perhaps this is what we badly need at this point in time, to prioritize, especially where evangelization and catechetics are concerned. Because at the end of the day, what we are speaking about is about educating for the good and meaningful life. That is why I again refer to Augustine. Augustine speaks about the interior teacher. As you know, Augustine refers so much to the magisterium of the church, which is, the teaching office of the church, of those who hold the teaching office. That is the magisterium. But then Augustine speaks about the magister who is interior, about the interior teacher. And I think in catechetics, this is mostly important, because educating for the good and meaningful life means also enabling these emerging generations, enabling them to appreciate authenticity. As you know, today, authenticity is a major and most central virtue which we need to educate to, because being authentic, it's much more important than being a practicing Catholic, than going to church. I'm not downplaying, going to church or practicing or praying, all that stuff is important. But what is mostly important today is authenticity, being authentic. And if we are educating to authenticity, well, we are investing. We are envisaging a future for the church, for the living tradition which we are trying to transmit. I remember once, I don't remember exactly in which text I read it, but I remember once I reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I'm quoting here, where Bonhoeffer wrote, exactly as I said in a book which I don't remember which, Christ not only makes people good, he makes them strong too. Because in the culture we live in the times we live in, I think that we need also to educate our generations to be strong, not just what is good or wrong, what is right or wrong, but even, how are we to become strong in the face of all the challenges we are being faced with, of all the challenges are. And of course, strength, well, as you know, the Latins used to speak about virtus, the strong man or woman. It is virtue which makes us strong. And as you all know, it was Aquinas himself who spoke about the so-called cardinal virtues, before coming to the theological virtues. Aquinas himself refers to the cardinal virtues, because at the end of the day, it is the strength of character. It is the strength, of someone who is seeking to be authentic in life. We need to be strong to face, whatever challenges come across. And in this sense, I think that we are being, challenged deeply and strongly. We cannot stick to simply the ethical issues. As you know, this is if we just look around us, even in our so-called old continent, of which we all form part, Europe, the European continent. Well, if we stick to the ethical issues, well, it seems that we have lost all the battles on the ethical level and from an ethical perspective, because for so long, we've had even entire, in the European continent, even entire Episcopal conferences, which what seemed to transpire was precisely that, if we legalize divorce and abortion and gay marriage, and all that stuff, then it's tragic. Yeah, I'm not saying that they are good things to do, but, on the ethical level, it seems that we've lost the battle. And that is why in his Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis speaks, for me it is something which is so important today. He says that, well, the gospel comes before ethics, because the gospel is not simply about what is right or wrong. The gospel is about discipleship. And I think that it is there that we need to focus. in this sense, of course, we all understand and acknowledge that we need to go back to the drawing board on so many levels. We need also, I spoke about reading the signs of the times. And of course, we've been doing that with the help of sociology, with the help of the social sciences especially. And that is of course, a bonus, I would say. But I think that the time has come for us to read the present, even from a biblical perspective. I mention here Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who, and I quote, he says, "True creative minorities," and I think that today we are a minority, but we need to be a creative minority. Jonathan Sacks says, I quote, "True creative minorities fight the battles of tomorrow, not of the past." And I think that, here we need to focus, because Jonathan Sacks, in a paper which he, I think it's now almost 10 years that he has given this paper on creative minorities, where, capturing the present day feeling of being in exile, because today we have this feeling of being in exile, parents who seem to be, as I said in the beginning, we have been rooted and formed in a Catholic tradition, and nowadays we feel we have this feeling of exile, in the sense we are outsiders, we are outsiders, we are foreigners in our lands, in our countries. Now, Jonathan Sacks, capturing this present day feeling of being in exile, of being outsiders, culturally speaking, yet, he gave vent to a voice of hope. And he refers to the letter to the exiles in Babylon, which we find in Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah, who in chapter 29 speaks, addresses the exiles in Babylon, telling them, well, you need not be negative, critically negative, but you need to live in the country where you are being exiled. You need to live there. You need to prosper there. Of course, appreciating, acknowledging, the living faith which we have received. But even when we are living with this feeling of exile, at the same time, we still have this hope, and we still have this vision. I see here, and I come to conclude, I see a very clear parallelism. That's why I said we need to read the present even from a biblical perspective, not only sociologically, because I see a very clear parallelism, for example, between the challenges ahead of us in the present time and, for example, the two books in the Bible of Ezra and Nehemiah. Who were these two prophets, I would say? Ezra and Nehemiah. Well, they were two very important figures who were enabling the people after the exile to a second exodus from exile. They were enabling Israel to come out of this feeling of exile and to return to Jerusalem. And so they were enabling Israel to a homecoming, feeling at home in our culture today, with all its negativity and with all its prosperity, feeling at home, but at the same time, maintaining the vision of the transcendent, maintaining the vision of He who is the creator. These two figures, very important figures, I repeat, were preparing the people to rediscover themselves as God's people. Again, focusing on the essentials. And for them, we can see from those two books, no, in the Old Testament Bible, focusing on the essentials. And what were the essentials? The assembly and God's word, the sense of community, the sense of believers coming together, belonging together, and the word of God, which of course continues to maintain in us this voice of hope, this prophetic vision. I think that, and here I conclude, my presentation. I think that this is for us mostly important, because, as you know, we are living in times when, so many people belong without believing, and so many others believe without belonging. But still, belonging remains a very important ingredient in our communities of faith. And I think that, we need to move on from the impasse in which for so many years we've been. Unfortunately, at some point, I speak at least from my experience in my country, the impasse in which we have been stuck for so long now. But we need to move on from this impasse to a prophetic future, to a future of the faith, which of course is an open future, because the God we believe in is not the God of the past, but it's the God of the future. God is, by his own nature, creative, innovative. We believe in him, and we believe that, of course, he gives us these prophetic voices to make us move on and see things from his perspective, not from our perspective. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Father Emeritus. If you had time for a little bit of dialogue, have you some time? Do you have some time to stay with us for a little dialogue?
Yes, you can. Yes, of course.
So, speak, yeah.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. I'd like you maybe just to unpack something a little bit. You talked about when you were talking about Augustine, and you were saying that, when we are, I suppose, looking at catechesis, that it needs to be transformative experience rather than transmitting doctrine. And then you mentioned that it has to be autobiographical. Can you just unpack that a little bit?
No. Yes, the transmission of faith needs to be autobiographical, in the sense that, for example, tomorrow is Sunday, and as is normal, I have to go to my parish and celebrate Mass and give a homily, Now, if I go tomorrow and the community, the congregation which I find there, I speak only in terms of doctrine. I go there and, pretend to give a lecture in theology or a lecture in doctrine. Well, that's not the case. I will be off the point. The transmission of the faith needs to be autobiographical, in the sense of we need to be very even subjective. If it's not my lived experience, so I would be a priest who is simply preaching doctrine. And the Christian faith there risks becoming an ideology, as many a time we have made it, an ideology. But if the faith which I'm trying to transmit is not a lived faith in me, is not a personal experience, in that sense it is autobiographical. And this goes not only for the priest who is preaching on Sunday, but it goes also for the catechist who is teaching, who is preparing children. It goes for all those who are preparing couples for marriage. It goes for parents who are trying to instill in their children the Christian faith. Autobiographical in the sense of it needs to be a lived faith, Otherwise, we continue to be preachy. And I think that today people refuse whoever is being just preachy. I don't know whether I explained it.
No, that's perfect. I suppose therein lies the rub, because, we were discussing this last night, that, the difference between religious education and catechesis, and how our teachers, when I would be post-primary, that for me is a huge thing. That, it makes all the difference when you have a teacher in a classroom who has lived even in any subject, actually, because it comes across. Because what you mentioned about the authenticity, people can see, particularly young people, when someone is authentic and they're not, and they don't even need to be speaking into doctrine. It's about even the way that you look at somebody, And I suppose at the moment we're developing a new curriculum in RE for post-primary. And I sometimes think what you were talking about, that we need to be so careful that it's not just this transmission of doctrine, that we have to look into this authenticity. And that means what makes us authentically human. And I think we often can skip that section, like what does it mean to be human? And our Lord understood this, and he was able to go directly into where people were talking about what it means to be human,
Even to be Christian is basically to be human.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that is, because at times we seem to present the faith and Christian living as if it is, a separate layer on daily life, And when we speak about authenticity, of course, you mention an issue which is quite a hot issue. What is the difference between, and I'm not going to enter into it, what is the difference between catechetics and religious education? But I think that even in teaching religion in schools, even if we have a mixed audience, a broader audience, I think that still the value of religion, not only of the Christian religion, but even the value of religion, which is, a tradition of wisdom which goes back even before Christianity itself. It is also a tradition of wisdom, and Christianity is part of that tradition of wisdom. And perhaps the tragedy nowadays is not because people, cannot choose between one religion and the other, but the tragedy would be, for me, people with no religion at all, people which see religion as if it's something of the past. We need to appreciate this tradition of wisdom, which we find in all religions together, and today that's why we speak so much about interreligious dialogue. That is important. But of course, when we come to teaching religion in schools, of course, it is not catechetics, strictly speaking. It is not. We are not in school. We are not preparing children to receive Holy Communion and confirmation. But we are preparing children, particularly students, particularly to the good life, to a meaningful life. And how religion, with all the other subjects they are studying in school, in their curricula, how religion can still figure as important, as of value, as relevant in their meaningful lives today. And I consider that very important. But of course, basically, it is, for me, authenticity is a major virtue. Because, and I think if we go to a reading of the gospel, the message of Jesus Christ was always a message in favor of being authentic. Not only Jesus Christ, but, as you know, Jesus Christ is in the prophetic legacy, tradition. If we go to the prophets in the Old Testament, it's always preaching authenticity. It's always, insisting on authenticity. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they are all, authenticity is the central issue.
That's right. You brought up something very important there, and as I said, we are developing this new curriculum, and I would have spoken to some of the teachers in my diocese, and what came back from the feedback was, which I suppose it maybe didn't come across in our curriculum, that we have, as you mentioned, people of mixed faiths in our Catholic school. And what I really liked what you said was that, we are proposing something to them. And I think we have to have this proposition and model that we say, look, come and see, as the Lord's attested, this is what we're proposing to you. And as you said, in this journey towards the good life, this is what we all want. It's a fundamental human desire to do something with our lives, to, this drive that we all have, even, young people. So how do we accompany our students? Or not only, how do we accompany our young teachers who maybe don't have much of a faith background? How do we accompany them to accompany our students in this search for the good life? How do we stay truthful, faithful to, the doctrine, and yet bring this in? Do you understand? Sorry, now I know that's a huge...
Well, accompanying, of course, is mostly important in education. And I think that basically, especially at that stage, we are speaking about school and about teaching and teaching religion. Well, I think what I consider at least mostly important is making people meet in the first place themselves. As you know, so many people, even children in schools, even our students, so many are alienated from themselves. They do not know who they are. They do not know what they want. They do not know what they believe in. And they do not know whom they belong to. As you know, mixed audiences in a class, in school, not only in terms of denominations and faiths and religions, but mixed audiences, even in, what they are carrying with them, conveying with them from home. Children, students who are going through tragic times in their parents' marriage, for example, or in their relationship with their parents. So basically, in education, this is what I consider mostly important, making those students first and foremost meet themselves, coming to know who they are, coming to appreciate who they are, independently, to some extent, independently of, where they belong to, as a family, as a religion, but basically that. And I think that at the end of the day, authenticity, that is what it's all about, that being authentic to some extent is, what is the opposite of authentic? Well, the opposite of authentic, I think it's, falsity, and falsity is something which Jesus has, spoke at length against. But, what is false? Falsity is that you are living a lie. I can be living a lie, even as a priest, if I'm not true to myself. If I preach, something to people, but which I'm myself, I'm not living out, and I'm not, well, that's false, that's being false. And so we become part of the fake news, not of the good news. But the good news is, well, it boils down for me, because Christian living boils down for me precisely to the issue of being authentic.
I think just, sorry now, I feel I'm monopolizing it here, but just, I'm very passionate about this particular thing that you said, and that's making people meet themselves, that we can often, in a curriculum, skip that, and how we can in some way kind of incorporate this into our curriculum, that, you know, I suppose that sense of who are they, like, what are we made for, what constitutes our humanity, you know, and getting them to explore that before we start introducing things about, you know, Christology and this is where we will capture them, because this is something that, you know.
Well, in my teaching experience, you know, at the university, teaching theology, for me, this was the most basic course which I've taught for so many years: anthropology, Christian anthropology. Why? Because I think that basically many of these issues which we are dealing with boil down to our anthropology. Unfortunately, for so long, we've perpetuated, even I would say, a false anthropology. You know, it seems that, you know, for us, anthropology, which is, you know, anthropos, the study of men, of the human being. Now, we've always had, you know, a very fixed idea of who we are as human beings. God created us, and we are, you know, men or women, and people are made in this manner and not in this manner. And ethically speaking, you know, this is how we behave. And well, anthropology today is an area which we need to explore much and much deeper, because we cannot pretend to have an exhaustive understanding of who the human being is, whoever he or she is. I think that in anthropology, so many things are at stake. In anthropology, in our understanding of the human being, we cannot go in a class, I cannot go in a lecture room and pretend to have a formula which applies to all. This is what happens to us when we have this fixed formula, where, of course, well, gay people do not figure, because gay people are gay people, and so they are excluded from this formula, which we have been always perpetuating. You know. No, I think that reading the present from God's perspective, having God's vision, even of humanity, which he himself created, having God's perspective opens us up. And that's why I think that anthropology, at least in theology, and I think also not only in theology, but even culturally speaking, sociologically speaking, I think that anthropology is the most evolving area of studies which today we experience. Because we do not have, you know, ready and given answers to everything. You know, there were times, as you know, for centuries, we had the penny, I remember the penny catechism. I don't know whether you remember it, you know. Well, the penny catechism was a CTS pamphlet where you had 100 questions. Well, at that time, the church taught that there are these 100 questions which have 100 given answers. And, you know, we cannot imagine someone coming with a question outside these 100 questions. The church, you know, imagined that these are all the questions that people can ask. We cannot be further from the truth. No. So I think we need to be open. We are explorers just as much as we are seekers. And in this, of course, we are accompanied by God himself, who is himself an explorer, who is himself, as I said, creative and imaginative.
Great, I think that's a good way to conclude, because I think our time has run out. But we want to say a big thank you. It's a very stimulating hour, very interesting conversation. Certainly provoked a lot of thoughts in us as regards what we're at in the endeavour of catechetics and religious education. So we're very, very grateful to you, Father Renè, and we wish you well for your many, obviously different works, from the hospital chaplaincy to the parish to the theology, catechesis, many aspects of your life. But thank you very much for a very, very stimulating.
Thank you. Thank you very much.